And you're live.
Okay, we're back. And I think we're gonna just work out scheduling a little bit, 9 and 2, going forward. And we're gonna start now with a walkthrough of the financial pieces of the bill, beginning on section with John's, beginning on section, the reading what it is. Four.
I'm actually going to if we should say that our format is just walk through and refrain from like, why don't you guys do this? And that's why we did that. Or do we want to have an office to do that way? After these probably been doing a walk through.
Yeah, I would rather like
Yeah.
wait
Yeah,
until tomorrow to
Yeah.
yeah.
Sounds good.
So clarifying questions only.
Yeah.
You're the sweetest.
You gotta be careful when you say around them. Already got it.
Hello, everyone. John Gray, Office of Elected Council. Would you guys like for me to screen share as past the Senate? Or would you like to see the side by side?
Maybe side by side. Side by side. It's great. It's really, we're doing this for people watching, so we're doing side by side. So, yeah.
Zoom in a little. Okay. So my sections start at section 34 and run through section 59. What you're going to see in the side by side is for any instance in which there are no differences, there is no text provided, but I'm happy to explain to you what is included in these sections on the show. So there's agreement. So sections 34, 35, and 36 are the same between the two bills. And these are your Title 16 definitions for state funding and public education. So this includes your base amount, $15,033. Section 35 is your weighting section. So this includes tiered weights for special education, for English language proficiency, and newcomer or slide. And then section 36 is kind of a conforming change. This is your education payments section. And this is just updating the defined terms to reference the concepts here of educational opportunity payment, supplemental district spending, and your small schools and sparsity support grants. No difference between sections 34 through 36. Section 37 is your support grants, and there is a difference between the approach taken here between the House and the Senate. On the left, you're seeing the House, and on the right, you're seeing the Senate. And the difference that you see between these two are what the area that demarcates sparsity is. So in the House proposal, you have sparse school districts, and those are school districts where the number of persons per square mile residing within that geographic boundaries is fewer than 55 persons. And the sparsity support grant there would be a sparsity support grant to each sparse school district in an amount determined by multiplying the 2-year average enrollment of each public school in the school district. So we pick up all public schools within that school district. Obviously, we don't know what the school district configurations are going to be, but it's making that sparsity determination at the district level. Whereas what you see on the Senate side is this definition of sparse area instead of sparse school district. This is a geographic area corresponding to a zip code where the number of persons per square mile residing within the geographic boundaries is fewer than 55 persons. So instead of district level sparsity analysis, it's at the zip code level. And then a sparse school is a school within that sparse area. Accordingly, your sparse school support grant it goes to each school district, but it's not for each public school in a sparse district. It goes to school districts for each sparse school within the school district. That, again, is based on that zip code determination. There's no difference between the dollar amounts with really good concepts that you're getting at. Just where is that geographic determination made for sparsity?
Well, isn't one, okay, no, forget it.
I think they're pretty big fiscal impacts for the change.
Yeah,
Sections 38 through 39 are the same. So 38 is just a description of the ed fund. So picking up revenues from the supplemental district spending tax. Section 39 is cleanup language for the stabilization reserve. And then section 40 is just your payment schedule, fund payments to school districts. The changes that you see in these sections that both chambers have agreed on is just picking up instead of education spending, EOP and supplemental district spending. So same across those sections. When we come to section 41, there actually is a very slight change here. And I realize we're looking, so this side by side was assembled this morning, and Beth super helpfully put this together. There are some like small things that may not show so readily. So there's a small conforming change to this section. It is not a substantive difference between the two, but because the Senate proposal, as we'll come to later in Kirby's sections, removes the property tax classifications, we have to have a conforming change here that just says when we reference the rate that is cited in the budget, it's a uniform homestead and uniform non-homestead, as opposed to one statewide education tax rate that's adjusted by property classification. So the concept is the same in both chambers, but anything you do related to property tax classification would affect this section 41. Section 42, sections 43, 44, and 45 are all the same between the two chambers. And just to go over those quickly, section 42 sets of repeals, including some language that is specific to the education, the current education funding system. And then importantly, there's a repeal of the census grant blocks for special education because you have the special education weights that has been repealed. Section 43 is your supplemental district spending reserve. That is the same between the two. So it provides for offsetting mathematical errors in the first instance and then overflow going to the school construction aid special fund. Sections 44 and 45 are sets of reports. There's the same between the chambers. So section 44 is transportation reimbursement guidelines from AOE. And then section 45 is reports from JFO on inflationary measures and pre-K funding. And then we come to sets of new sections as passed by the Senate. So first is section 45A. This is tasking JFO with contracting with a contractor with expertise in Vermont's education funding system to develop a cost factor foundation formula for Vermont's education system that includes tiered weights for CTE, English learners, special ed, any other weights determined to be empirically necessary for an adequate and equitable education. It also includes, I talked in that difference between the sparsity support grants about the geographic area. This would task the contractor with recommending suitable geographic measures for determining sparsity and specifically addressing using zip code as a geographic measure because there could be some problems with that approach. So the report would include a detailed explanation of the analysis of the work done to arrive at recommended weights and whether it costs more to educate a secondary student than an elementary student. Would submit that foundation formula and analysis of geographic measures to Ways and Means, Finance, on Education on or before December 1, 2026. So unlike other reports you see that have dates at the end of this year, this is the end of next year, December 1, 2026, and there's an appropriation to hire this consultant of $150,000. So a report on a cost factor foundation formula that addresses these specific factors, these kinds of tiered weights, including CTE, addressing the cost of educating secondary students, and then that would be at the end of next year. Section 45B is a transitionary measure for the first 5 years. In the 5th year, you would fully transition, moving school districts off of education spending and onto their educational opportunity payment. This would happen by determining what we call a transition gap. This is the difference between the school district's education spending in fiscal year 28 and its EOP as calculated in the year for which you're determining the gap. And basically what happens is you divide that gap up into increments of 5, and each year as you move, you're moving 20% of that gap toward the EOP. So over 5 years, so it's a smooth the movement from ed spending in FY28 to the EOP. One thing that is worth noting with the transition gap, and we'll come to a section later that touches on this as well, but in a different way, is the transition gap under this is determined each year. For each year, you determine that EOP in that year. So it's not going to be complete equal 20% increment each year, right? But the attempt is to try to get at a fit of the difference between your ed spend and your EOP in each year. So you're moved closer and you're either moved up towards your EOP if your ed spending is below, or you're moved down if your ed spending is above your EOP. With folks to be fully transitioned in fiscal year 2034. Section 45C, this is a request from the tax department. The Education Fund Advisory Committee, which is in existing law, is to have its first meeting on or before July 15th of this year. This would delay that first meeting to 2027, and the rationale that was stated related to just the amount of transformative change happening in this space. Section 46 is jumping to your supplemental district spending, and there is one change between the approaches here, and it relates to the cap. So what you see is your definition of supplemental district spending includes a 10% cap. On the House side, this is 10% of the school district's EOP, and if you think about what EOP is, it's your base times your weighted long-term membership. The difference in the Senate proposal is 10% of product of the base amount and the school district's long-term membership, so unweighted. Basically, the difference is whether you're using weighted count to determine EOP or you're using an unweighted count. And so the 10% of your unweighted count on the Senate side would be a lower count. Section 47 is, we're in Title 32 talking about the imposition of the rates to raise these education funds. So there's a pretty substantial difference here tied to the removal of the property tax classifications. If you look on the left side, the House's proposal, it includes this little table here. And so the imposition of the statewide tax rate, so this is not your supplemental district spending, but just raising your statewide education tax, is done by determining one statewide education tax rate. And then for your different classifications, homestead, non-homestead, apartment, non-residential, or residential, you multiply that by a particular factor. In this case, the factors are 1. So in effect, it's a uniform tax rate across all classes. The difference that's taken on the Senate side is that you don't have the property tax classifications. So instead of having a table with different rates in a fixed relationship to each other, we just have that the statewide education tax is imposed on the non-homestead property at a uniform tax rate for non-homestead and a uniform tax rate for homestead property. In both cases, you're funding the same pieces. It's just the way that you do this. I would note that on the Senate side, there is no specified relationship between the non-homestead and homestead rates, right? So we don't know if it would be a factor of 1, 2. You could set those in different ways. The rest of the changes you're going to see in this section are conforming changes that flow from that removal of the property tax classifications. On the House side, we need to reference the applicable rate as adjusted. On the Senate side, we reference the homestead or non-homestead rate. This, to me, purple, but maybe not so much to other people, I'm colorblind, language is just language that is struck in one of Kirby's sections and will not be present for the point that this hits on. So I think that this is a non-issue, but that's why that's highlighted there.
So if this language is gone, that's what you're saying?
It will be gone. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's gone. On the House side, it had been struck because I didn't realize that Kirby's sections earlier amended that same section to remove it. And then on the Senate side, I believe that I removed it because it wouldn't be present at the time that this came online.
So it's removable.
Yep.
Versions.
Exactly.
I would call it adjustment.
Yep. I wish that I knew what magenta was. There are there's one other change, but you could call it 2 sets of changes here related to the entity that determines net payments. You see on the Senate side, Secretary of Education determines these net tax payments for school districts, and the secretary that receives that grand list information and prescribes payments being paid by return. On this House side, that existing law had been updated to the Commissioner of Taxes. So it's a difference between who the entity tasked with doing these net payments. On the House side, that's Commissioner of Taxes, and the Senate side is Secretary of Education. You're going to see that same set of changes done for the supplemental spending tax. These sections are otherwise the same. They use the same mechanics to determine that supplemental rate. But here you see, right, on the House side, Commissioner of Taxes to determine that net payment, and on the Senate side, Secretary of Education. Section 4 is your December 1 letter.
Senator, thank you.
And so you're going to see more flow through changes here relating to removal of those property tax classifications, right? So on the House side, one statewide education property tax rate is proposed and recommended in the December 1 letter. And that would be adjusted, right, over different classifications. On the Senate side, you're receiving a recommendation for a non-homestead rate and a homestead property tax rate. So whatever happens with property tax classifications will affect this section. We come next to a similar transition mechanism for the tax rates themselves. So section 48A, your homestead property tax rate transition across the same years. So fiscal years 2030 through 2033, which are your first 4 years of that transition. School district's homestead property tax rate would be adjusted in a very similar manner to what you saw for the EOP. This is the same concept that was discussed in Senate filings previously. So it's over that 5-year period. And note that unlike the EOP transition, where you're determining that gap yearly, right? You're looking at the gap between your FY28 ed spend and your EOP in that year. In this case, what you're determining is a gap between, it's a fixed gap. It's what that homestead property tax rate would be in the first year if you had no transition mechanism. So covering all expenditures from the ed fund. And then against a district's homestead property tax rate in fiscal year 29. So just getting at the gap between the what would be the FY30 uniform rate, homestead rate, against what that district's FY29 homestead property tax rate is. And you use this gap to determine a discount or penalty on that rate, essentially, because we still have to set the rates sufficient to cover the expenditures. So this gap is determined to provide a cent discount or penalty on a district's rate across those 5 years to try to similarly smooth the transition of the tax rate. Section 49 is just conforming changes in your statewide property tax rate section. It's the same across both. And then section 50, it's similarly conforming changes, but note that there's a difference related to property tax classifications here. On the House side, we reference the statewide education tax rate, and on the Senate side, we reference the homestead and non rates. At section 51, we have moved out of our statewide education tax rate and supplemental spending tax rate, and we're now talking about the property tax credit repeal and replacement with a homestead exemption. Section 51 is just setting out the statutory purpose of that homestead exemption. It's the same across both chambers. And then section 52 does take a different approach to the homestead exemption. And just to note, this section 52, unlike all the other sections, is amending a full chapter. So that's why this section is quite large. The real differences in this proposal come down to the income brackets, the percentages, and the house site value against which that is provided. So on the House site, on the House side, you have an exemption, a homestead exemption proposed that has these brackets. So I'm just going to start here. It goes from, if there's less than 25,000, an uncapped exemption of 95% of the claimant's house site value. If you're between 25 and 47K, an exemption of 90%, and you can see kind of smooth step in 47 to 50, you get 80%, 50 to 60, you get 70, and all the way up to between 110 and 115,000, the exemption will be 10% of the claimant's house site value, and folks above that 115,000, no amount of house site value would be exempt from the section. Note that there is no cap proposed as to the house site value against which that exemption is made available, and you have the different brackets here, right? And you move in, close to 10% increments for most of these, and you just have at the top a 5% increment here. On the Senate side, these are set out, it looks quite different because it's set out in a table, but it's a similar concept, just using different income brackets and different percentages, right? So on the Senate side, the homestead exemption that is available is provided against the first $425,000 in house site value. If you're below 50K in income, and you can see your relevant percentages there. So if you're at the bottom most income bracket, you get a 99% homestead exemption against the first 425,000. And then you have a table for if you're above 50 and up to 100,000, which is the highest income at which this would be available in the Senate proposal, you get that exemption against the first $400,000 in house site value. And this is the concept that Senate Finance had proposed.
John, are there inflators on this?
There are inflators built in. Yes, and I may
In both versions?
in both versions there are inflators. I would note that they
Do they apply to the brackets as well as the house site value?
exactly. So that is one of the differences here is that on the house side, the way the inflator is described is it applies to all dollar amounts and it references subdivision 81 or something to that effect. On the house side, that would only pick up the income brackets because you aren't listing out a house site value, right? Because the cap isn't proposed on that side. On the Senate side, the inflator would apply against both the income brackets and that house site value because it's a reference to the dollar amounts in that section. So the inflator would apply across different pieces.
On these, John, is there still the cap on how much credit the homeowner can receive? I believe the current law is 5,600-ish.
We do have tweaks to those sections to try to mirror existing. There wasn't an attempt to change on either side the way that those mechanisms work. And let me just get up to basically, we try to maintain the same, like the instances in which someone would avail themselves of the PTC under current law, they're meant to be entitled to the same kind of benefit from the homestead exemption under the proposals in both houses.
I don't know.
So like when we allocate rates, when we have to make allocations for someone who's part of a co-op or they're surrounded by trust land or the like, the same measures we took to make sure that those folks were able to avail themselves of the benefit of the property tax credit, someone who's receiving the homestead exemption would receive. And I think we've tried to take similar measures for the cap, which you're proposing.
I just don't see anything about it in here, which leads me to believe that it's untouched, it's still there.
So part of what you're seeing here is the differences between the two, right? So let me just flip through my sections, which build out the full. Yes, okay, we'll come to it in section 60, 67. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Just down, I think it is. Where it shows here. Okay, I can. So in section 60, 67, in existing law, we have a line that says no taxpayer shall receive a venture credit in excess of $2,500. No taxpayer shall receive a property tax credit greater than $2,400 or cumulative credit under your sections of 60, 66 of this title greater than $5,600. The line related to cumulative credit has been struck, that $5,600 figure. I think on the basis that you would not be getting the that exception and the venture credit. So, and if it's helpful for you to see just the struck language here. This
Okay. So, but it's 60, 67. Okay.
Yep.
I'm gonna ask a question back on the table, just to understand.
Yes.
Essentially, if you're a couple and your household income is 125,000, you're not getting any benefits.
You would not get a homestead exemption under either proposal.
Yeah.
That's correct.
What if it was 110?
If it's 110, then you would get a 10% exemption on the house side, and you would not get an exemption on the Senate side. Because it caps out at hurricane.
And it's only up, but do we on the Senate, on the House side, I apologize for taking the time. We don't have a house site value.
There is no cap on the house site value. That's right. And just to offer the Senate proposal here had been drawn with the idea, I think, of trying to account for the same cost as the existing property tax credit. I think is.
And this always throws me, we're using the terms house site and homestead.
Yes, so house site is a narrower,
That's the house
Category.
makers,
exactly.
which is used in the House side, but in the Senate side, it only uses the word homestead.
No, it uses house site value, so it's an example
Oh, there it
against
is.
the house
Sorry.
site value.
Thank you.
It's in the table.
Yep.
And it's consistent with the way that we deal with income sensitivity measures in existing law too. So it's not a change to the piece against which you are providing the benefit. Just the method of delivery, right? Versus a property tax credit. There are informing changes for just the difference in property tax classification throughout the remainder of this section. So that's why you see some highlighting of homestead in different places as against statewide association tax rate. Section 53 is the same across both the House and Senate. And this is that updating the homestead declaration form to reflect information for needs of the homestead exemption. The Senate does have new language in section 53A. This is your homestead exemption report. So this is tasking tax on or before January 15th of next year in consultation with JFO with submitting a proposal to Ways and Means Finance, designing a homestead exemption that minimizes property tax impacts for homestead property owners under the new education tax structure, minimizes benefit cliffs compared to the existing credit system, and minimizes aggregate fiscal impact relative to the existing credit system. So if folks are uncomfortable with the proposed homestead exemption, you have a board on other ways to achieve these three considerations in the development of that exemption. It would include with its proposal recommendations for an inflationary adjustment measure that is suited to both the income sensitivity and that house site value. So you could have separate inflationary measures, for instance, that address each of those. Sections 54 through 56 are just small conforming changes for the homestead exemption. No changes between the two chambers, no differences between the two chambers. And then section 57 is a contingently effective. So this is at the rollout of the foundation formula. The Ed Fund Advisory Committee. This tasks the Ed Fund Advisory Committee with providing certain recommendations, including national best practices for addressing inter-school district effects, whether to transition to an evidence-based foundation formula. And what you see newly proposed on the Senate side is methods for ensuring school districts spend their EOP on the costs that underlie that foundation formula. So are folks allocating their EOP in ways with the money that they're receiving, essentially. Sections 58 and 59 are placeholder contingently effective sections. If you one day move to an evidence-based formula, these would be sections that update the base amount and your weights. So these are your inputs to a foundation formula. No changes, no differences between the two proposals. And that is the full extent of what I have here. Happy to answer any questions or turn it over to anyone else who would like to be in the chair. Other than that,
Does Kirby cover the final section?
Kirby does have the final sections.
Should our contracts would be like,
Mhm.
come on.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, John. That was really helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, you could just sit there and so you could just operate the thing from there.
That sounds incredibly fun.
Sorry, John.
You're
not.
Sure.
Let's say council. Just joining Zoom right now, I think. Listening for all. Okay. Right. Okay, so for the final section of the bill, we start in section 60 with sorry, there's not the language here right here, but this is the statute on the grand list. There was a change in the definition of parcel that is the same in both sections. That has to do with data collection. And the change or the difference is that the Senate removed a reference to property tax classifications in that section. And then in section 61, this is the bulk of the changes that we'll see for the rest of it. In the House version on the left there, you had the establishment of property tax classifications starting in January of 2029. And in section 61 of the Senate version, you have a study where the Department of Taxes will take a look at the topic and consider all that would go into implementation of that and to report back at the end of this year. So all the language on the left there is just from the classification from the House side. And then that brings us to section 61A and 61B from the House version, which the first section there has to do with transition language for property tax classifications. 61B had to do with an implementation report that was to come back and setting that up. Both of those were removed when the language establishing the tax classifications and the Senate version was also removed. In section 62, you have the beginning of the establishment of statewide and regional property assessment districts. This is to start January 1st, 2030. Those are unchanged, except for just a little bit of clarifying language in the transition provisions that are in section 63 of the Senate version. Substantively, they're the same for section 62, 63, 64, all relating to setting up regional assessment districts. And then section 65 all the way through 94 of the House version were all conforming provisions to change the grand list in the future to a January 1 grand list date as opposed to the current April 1 grand list date. The Senate removed those, but the Senate kept in the language in a report in the regional assessment district sections from the tax department to send language back for next session that would they would run it through the stakeholder group that they're going to be working on in summer and fall and come back with those conforming changes to change to a grand list date. So no intent to not do that, but just a waiting to put it into the law here. And that brings us to what is in the Senate section, section 65, and what is in the House version is section 91, which is these are the miscellaneous provisions, and then they're the same except the Senate added one. So the first one is some adding back some language that was inadvertently removed a few years ago in section 66A of the law. It is the provision that John referenced with where the magenta came up before, because we have this miscellaneous provision here to add this back, but then we had accidentally left it out of the law that was changing in the future. So we were going to do the same thing again. We accidentally removed this piece of language that doesn't have a lot of substance to it. But that's what's going on there. Technical stuff.
And I know we're not doing explanations, but I just want to like context. We didn't have a miscellaneous tax bill this year. And so all the miscellaneous stuff is it has nothing to do with 454, particularly except about property taxes.
So yeah, these are all property tax, property valuation related miscellaneous provisions. So section 92 is the addition of a minimum tax debt before a municipality can start a tax sale. This came from a working group that had reported back to the legislature this session with recommendations, and their one recommendation was to put a $1,500 minimum before a tax sale can be initiated. So that's what 92 does. It's the same thing in both versions of the bill. In section 93, it is a change in how PBR hearing officers are compensated. So a request from the Department of Taxes. It's the same in both versions. In section 94, the House side, 68 on the Senate side, you have a technical change that removed a reference to a $15 late penalty for the property tax credit. Has no substantive effect because that was done away with last year. It was just there's a reference to it there that needed to be removed. And then in section 69 of the Senate version, there's another technical miscellaneous provision added that crosses out some language that would cause the math to be incorrect under the current system when the statewide adjustments apply. And those are my.
Thanks, Bruce.
So tomorrow morning, we'll talk to our whys and wherefores.
Anything else? Anyone wants to talk about that?